welcome to Praxis and Theodicy. In the last video, we talked about the foundations of capitalism: private property, competitive markets, and investment. But that simple definition isn't entirely descriptive of what we have today. In the past 50 years, capitalism has shifted into a model that puts interest and debt into every space of everyday life for every participant. Arguably, it was inevitable. The core of capitalism is the cycle of investing, of putting one's wealth into a place where it can be used to create more wealth, and then demanding, by contract, a share in that wealth. This broad definition doesn't fit every definition of usury that we explored in previous videos, but certain facets of capitalism do easily fit. You see, there's a certain disparity between the idealistic goal of capitalism and the goal of the primary actors within capitalism. Ideally, the goal of capitalism is to be an economic system where wealth is subjected to nothing but natural selection that funnels it towards productive enterprises, those things which will produce a more wealthy, prosperous society. It does this by offering up a goal to its players: gain as much personal wealth as possible by any means which the market formulates. If the players of the game have the goal of making as much wealth as possible, they'll eventually find ways to ignore the idealistic goal of finding prosperous investments. Instead, new ways of acquiring money can be found to make that personal goal easier, in ways that nullify the ultimate goal. If private property is a contract that gives me total dominion over a thing, I can then use my dominion to turn it into capital. If it doesn't produce wealth by itself, I can simply use the free market to dictate conditions under which the use of the thing itself gets me money. For example, a house can't be used like a factory or a farm to produce wealth, so the ideal goal of capitalism would dictate that it isn't a proper investment. But a capitalist can use the free market to create a condition under which having dominion of that house can get some wealth for himself. He can purchase it and then charge for the use of it. This is the process of commodification, turning something into a commodity that can be put on the market. This requires exploiting each of the three factors of capitalism together. The free market is used to turn non-capital private property into personal capital, a source of wealth for only one person. Banks earn wealth from interest charged on loans or mortgages. Capitalists extract the surplus value of labor that the working class produced from using his factory. Landlords charge rent from lower-class citizens who need a place to live. All of this falls under one or another of our definitions of usury. The interest charged on home mortgages absolutely qualifies as usury by the most traditional understanding. If you look around you, you're likely to notice that most economic activity relies on this cycle of investment. The needs to invest or to seek other means of passive income were not always as ever-present in our society as they seem to be today. Value of currency rose and fell at different intervals, but it was not until the early 1970s that inflation, as we understand it today, became a reality. From that point on, it became a truth that if you aren't investing your money, you're losing money. This is largely a result of the US dollar becoming a fiat currency in 1971, setting off the steady, persistent inflation that continues to this day. For about a decade, economists and state authorities began slowly and steadily looking for a way to stop the world economy from crashing while refusing to return to the Keynesian economic policies that pulled the United States out of the Great Depression 50 years earlier. The answer came in the economic policies of Augusto Pinochet, a fascist dictator of Chile who came to power in 1973 under a military coup assisted by the United States under Richard Nixon. This economic policy consisted of giving away or selling state-controlled enterprises, including Social Security, to private oligarchs who were accountable to no one and nothing but the invisible hand of the free market. His goal was to make Chile not a nation of proletarians, but a nation of proprietors. In other words, it refocused the economics of Chile from those who work for a living to those who own for a living. Pinochet got the results he wanted. Chile's economy recovered and grew, but so did wealth inequality and generational poverty, as those who were given private ownership of the means of production benefited strongly under the privatization policies, those who continued to work to ensure that wealth were created were badly hurt by the austerity measures of the new regime. An economy that pretends that ownership and investment can create wealth does so at the expense of those who truly work to create that wealth. Pinochet's success was lauded by the think tanks whose economists and authorities had been hard at work brainstorming a way to influence policy to favor the ownership class and diminish the power of the working class, a task that had begun largely in the aftermath of the 1971 Powell Memo. The culmination of their efforts came when they landed the support of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the twin leaders of what would become known as neoliberalism. Mimicking Pinochet's policy, they began attacking labor unions, increasing privatization of public systems, and instituting austerity measures to the working class. The goal was to create economic growth. In fact, to finally give in to the impossible, unceasing economic growth that capitalism requires. Inflation was not curbed. It continued as normal, but the new institution made clear that those who would survive in the new order would do so by owning a piece of the ever-expanding pie. The area of Keynesian economics had hinted at a world where people worked cooperatively, democratically, and those who owned for a living, those who Keynes called the rentier class, would slowly fade into obscurity. I can't find a better way to sum up the rise of the new way forward any better than David Graeber does, so I'll quote him at length as he talks about what he calls the new dispensation. When Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK launched a systemic attack on the power of labor unions, as well as on the legacy of Keynes, it was a way of explicitly declaring that all previous deals were off. The link between productivity and wages was chopped to bits. Productivity rates have continued to rise, but wages have stagnated or even atrophied. In the new dispensation, wages would no longer rise, but workers were encouraged to buy a piece of capitalism. Rather than euthanize the rentiers, everyone could now become a rentier. Effectively, could grab a chunk of the profits created by their own increasingly dramatic rates of exploitation. The means were many and familiar. In the United States, there were 401k retirement accounts and an endless variety of other ways of encouraging ordinary citizens to play the market, but at the same time encouraging them to borrow. One of the guiding principles of Thatcherism and Reaganism alike was that economic reforms would never gain widespread support unless ordinary working people could at least aspire to owning their own homes. To this was added, by the 1900s and 2000s, endless mortgage refinancing schemes that treated houses whose value it was assumed would only rise like ATMs, as the popular phrase had it, though it turns out in retrospect it was really more like credit cards. Then there was the proliferation of actual credit cards juggled against one another. Here, for many, buying a piece of capitalism slithered undetectably into something indistinguishable from the familiar scourges of the working poor, the loan shark and the pawnbroker. It did not help here that, in 1980, the U.S. federal usury laws, which had previously limited interest to between 7 and 10%, were eliminated by act of Congress, making real interest rates of 25, 50, or even up to 6,000% annually perfectly legal. Any number of names have been coined to describe the new dispensation, from the democratization of finance to the financialization of everyday life. Outside the United States, it became known as neoliberalism. As an ideology, it meant that not just the market, but capitalism became the organizing principle of almost everything. We were all to think of ourselves as tiny corporations, organized around that same relationship of investor and executive, between the cold, calculating math of the banker and the warrior who, indebted, had abandoned any sense of personal honor and turned himself into a kind of disgraced machine. It's easy to become a bit hopeless when faced with the way capitalism has changed our world to one where usury is not only no longer a discouraged act, but one where everyone is persuaded to engage in usurious exchanges as a means to survive. We're going to be wrapping up our series on usury shortly. In the next video, we're really going to break it down and examine exactly what makes usury so harmful to society and to individuals, and we're going to use that as a springboard to examine what institutions and practices in our society could be considered usurious. In our final video, we're going to examine exactly how a Christian should respond in today's society and how the church should respond.